Um, oh, I got to click that button that says continue. Okay, I just want to reiterate what Nate just said. I want to thank everyone that dialed in to this Zoom. That includes the new Catalyst award teams, the PIs, and some of their teammates, some of the team members. I want to thank all the summer interns and the academic year interns that have dialed in, and we really appreciate your participation. Also want to thank people from the Catalyst team and Innovation Ventures. And yeah, it's really great that you're all here. And what I'm going to start, the other thing I want to mention is there's a group of people here that are also from the Center for Cellular Construction, which is this really interesting institute across 6 different institutions. You can see them there, UCSF, UC Berkeley, Stanford, San Francisco State, IBM, and the Exploratorium. And their focus, you can see at the quote I just grabbed off their website a few minutes ago, their mission is to turn cell biology into an engineering discipline. And so they're participating in these workshops today as well. And so, yeah, so this is the first of 3 workshops. I'm going to start off right now, or in a minute or so, just introducing the concept of a target product profile and why it's important. And then, as Nate already mentioned, Ken Fang, a very active Catalyst industry advisor, a physician, and an expert in diagnostics and medical devices and digital health, is going to be talking after me about why the target product profile is so important. And then next month, we have a month from now, I think that's a Wednesday actually, we have 2 other talks, one on intellectual property from Erica Pascal, who is a PhD in like eukaryotic gene expression, and then worked for 9 years in Novartis, and then got her law degree, and now has a practice focused on intellectual property, specifically with a focus on academic startups. And Rupa Ramamurthy, who's the Senior Associate Director of the Invent Fund and the Catalyst Program, and also a certificated project manager, is going to talk about project management and the tools of project management. And I'll say this, a target product profile is a project management tool. And then in August, we've got 2 talks on, entrepreneurship itself, and Jenny Jancy with both UCSF Launchpad and the Catalyst program is going to talk about that, as well as an attorney from Wilson Sonsini around company formation. And so I'm really looking forward to the other 5 talks. And then, as Nate already said, what we're hoping to do tonight, this afternoon, is after Ken and I are done, is to have Zoom breakout rooms for each of the projects. And there'll also be a breakout room for everybody from the CCC, the Center for Cellular Construction, that's here. So thanks for that. The other thing I'll mention right now is questions tonight are totally welcome by both me and Ken. And so you can either type them in the chat or type them in the Q&A, and Nate is actually going to be monitoring that, and he'll chime in because I can't see it at all. I'm only seeing my slide. So Nate's going to be monitoring that, and he'll interrupt me or he'll interrupt Ken and pass on your question. Or you can just raise your hand and he'll spot that probably on the Zoom. But although there's more than 1 page of people, so might miss it. So I'm going to start off just with a couple of words about a target product profile, TPP. And I'm just going to go through these 5 bullets sort of slowly because each one is sort of making a point. And so the first bullet, it's really a detailed description of what features or attributes that a product has to have in order to be successful. And these features what we try to capture are both the optimal features, like, oh my goodness, in the perfect world, it would be able to do this, but the world's obviously not perfect, but it's also the minimal features. So the minimal attributes in order to be successful. And the second point is really important. It does really embody beginning with the end in mind. And this is super important in an academic setting like we're all in. Because as we all know, professors are trained to follow their data. They're trained to pivot if the data says pivot. They're trained that if the line of research you're on was going to get a paper in the biochemical journal, but if you pivot, you might get a cell paper. We're trained to pivot. When it comes to commercializing ideas in the context of patient benefit, you really need to have the blinders on. You really need to have your focus on what you're seeking out. Now, I'm not saying that you create one of these TPPs and the whole thing's carved in stone and you're sticking to it regardless, right? I'm not saying that. Okay, third bullet. It includes the scientific, technical, clinical, business, and market information that's required. Now, interestingly, as you know, UCSF it's only health. There's a medical school, a dental school, a nursing school, a pharmacy school. I like to say that, there's no college kids, there's no football team. It's really just health focus. Obviously, basic research, PhD students and postdocs, and also professional students, med students, dental students, residents, fellows, et cetera. But no law students, no business students, not really engineering students. And so that's why we reached out to local colleges and universities, like San Francisco State, like UC Berkeley, like Stanford, to try to get interns that are studying, business or law or engineering to help on those components of the TPP, because they're actually, I'm not going to say they're the most important, but they're very, very important. Okay, this fourth bullet, I've already mentioned. The TPP identifies both the optimal and the minimal attributes. And these words in not in parentheses, these words in italics are important, that these are the thresholds you will use to determine if your candidate's performance is acceptable to moving forward to it. And I like to use just one example right now. And let's say you're a drug discoverer. And actually, I spent 30 years doing drug discovery. So I consider myself a drug discoverer. And let's say you're working on a project and you're hoping that the drug candidate would be orally bioavailable. I mean, you're hoping that the drug would be in a pill form that the patient would swallow it. But no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't achieve oral bioavailability. But you say to yourself, well, heck, a lot of medicines are injected. They're either intravenous or they're subcutaneous. So let's just keep going. Well, depending upon what your drug is for, that could be a very, very serious mistake, because if you develop the drug and it's in a needle, it's an injectable drug, it could be then that doctors won't prescribe it and patients won't take it. And so the TPP, this is just one example I told you. Depending upon the indication and what disease we're talking about, it may well be that the drug has to be in a pill, that it can't be an injectable. And so that's what the target product profile sort of sets out from the beginning. What are the minimum attributes that you need to be successful? And I'm glad I put this fifth bullet in here because it is dynamic. I'm not saying, like I said, it's not like it's carved in stone and you're set for life. I mean, this is a dynamic document that you really almost have to force, well, you shouldn't have to, but you may have to force yourself to revisit periodically, whatever that is, once a year, once a quarter, whatever. Okay, now we're using the target product profiles in these translational projects in the Catalyst program and the CCC. These target product profiles, they're actually used in different organizations in different contexts, and I'm just touching on them in this, with this slide, because the first one, the first bullet is really what I'm talking about, what we're talking about. The focus is that these are planning tools, they're project management tools that guide the translational advancement, that guide the development towards the desired product, hopefully. Now, interestingly, and I actually have another slide on this, interestingly, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, encourages pharmaceutical and medical device companies to create TPPs. And why they encourage them to make them is they want the TPP to be the basis of the communication. So there's no like ambiguity, that both parties are clear on what the sponsor, that is the company, is trying to do. So it's really interesting. And in the context of global health, you know, health advances, but sort of in the developing nations, TPPs are really important tools to help researchers find out what's needed in the developing world. And the World Health Organization uses TPPs to set the targets for diseases like, you know, malaria and drug-resistant tuberculosis, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I'm talking about global health diseases. Okay, so I'm going to move to just a few words about the Catalyst program. The Catalyst program is UCSF's translational accelerator. It got started 11 years ago. This was the press release that went out from UCSF. And you can see what I underlined in red at the bottom. Successful applicants may receive some financial support. The real prize is a detailed consultation from the panel of experts. And we call those our volunteer industry advisors. And it's true. And some people have heard me say this like 3 times. And so I'm saying this for those that haven't heard me say this. If this is just sort of in general, if I ask a professor, why are you applying for a Catalyst Award? The answer will tend to be, she'll say, oh, you know, I can really use the seed funding because my grant doesn't allow translational studies to be funded. And it'll be really nice to get the input and the advice of the advisors. But then if you ask a professor that was a Catalyst awardee, you know, 4 years ago, and you run into him someplace, you know, oh, what was it? What, can you tell me what you liked about the program? He'll tend to say, oh, the mentorship from the industry advisors was invaluable, and it was nice to get the funding as well. And so the whole primacy, the primary, secondary aspect is sort of switched. And it's actually true that it's really our industry advisors that are the secret sauce to Catalyst. And so, like I said, well, I will say now that the centerpiece of the Catalyst program are the Catalyst Awards, and professors apply for these. And I've already said this, they get the input of the industry advisors and they get seed funding. And you'll see at the top that Catalyst supports projects that are across a number of different, you know, product development tracks or types. New therapeutics, new diagnostics, new medical devices, digital health solutions, and biotools, you know, platforms. And then we also have an internship program. And again, thanks for all of you for joining that. Across these 5 tracks, Catalyst, over its 10 years, has supported projects across almost all imaginable subcategories within these 5 tracks. I'm not going to read these out. You can just kind of like skim them. And I am going to, yeah, Nate said this is going to be taped, or it is being recorded, but we will be sending out, Ken and I will be sending out our PowerPoint presentations, and so you can look at my slides and his slides at your leisure. And then there's also, interestingly, there's also ideas or inventions or discoveries that the products are hybrids across these. And this is just some examples of products that are both therapeutic and diagnostic, or they're digital health and their medical devices, or their digital health and therapeutics. And so the Catalyst program, our role is to help professors that have ideas or discoveries or inventions that could be advanced to commercialization for patient benefit. And then at the right side of this slide are possible, they use that word exits, possible exits of these projects as they advance along the translational path. And so they could go into an incubator, like the QB3 incubator on campus, or on the UCSF campus and other locations. Beautiful new QB3 incubator in Berkeley. It used to be the Art Museum, just opened. Just unbelievably fantastic architecture. Go into SBA, get funding through SBI, government, federal funding, SBIRs. They go into a capital A accelerator. Catalyst we refer to as a lowercase a, because the funding it's not dilutive funding. Accelerators like Y Combinator or Techstars or 500 startups and the like, they take a little piece of the pie in exchange for nurturing your program along. They could get out licensed. I'm running down this list. They could get out licensed to a company. You could partner with a company, or you could even start a startup company. This is the Catalyst team. Nate already introduced them, but Rupa Ramamurthy, Senior Associate Director. Rupa focuses on the therapeutics and medical device tracks. Jenny Jancy, Program Director, focuses on diagnostics, digital health, and biotools. She's also the Director of the UCSF Launchpad, which is focused on entrepreneurship. I should say that Rupa's also focused on the Invent Fund, which is this fascinating other exit from Catalyst that I'm not going to talk about right now, but I encourage you to ask myself or Rupa about it. And then at the bottom, Nate is the Senior Program Manager for Catalyst. He also works on the Invent Fund. He also works with the Launchpad. So that's myself, and these 3 are the Catalyst program. Back to the advisors, the industry advisors. There's like 75 right now that are super active, and about 100 that are semi-active. I mean, there's another couple dozen that are semi-active, and they really cross all the disciplines of healthcare disciplines, if you will. I'm not going to go through this list, but just to point out some in particular, we have medicinal chemists, we have preclinical toxicologists, people experts in formulation, people that are experts in regulatory affairs, like dealing with the FDA. And of course, we're all very, very familiar with the FDA with respect to emergency use authorizations as opposed to regular product approvals, et cetera. We have experts in biostats and artificial intelligence, machine learning, and medical devices, developing prototypes. And then across the board, reimbursement, which I'm not going to discuss now, but it turns out to be very, very, very important. That if you're going to develop a product, whether it's a drug or a diagnostic test or a medical device, you really want to be sure that the insurance companies will pay for their patients, their customers to get that product prescribed. And so the Catalyst Awards, when the professors apply, these are the things they've got to capture. Like they have to the application, this is what the application contains. And this is also what the advisors who choose the projects base their decisions on. So the unmet medical need, the technical rationale for achieving a solution, the feasibility of getting to the finish line, whether there's an opportunity to garner patents or other intellectual property, and the chance for it to be successfully commercialized. And the way Catalyst works is that the applications come in, they go out to the advisors by email who evaluate them and rank them. And the advisors choose who are going to be the finalists. And the finalists pitch, they make their case to all the advisors that are assembled. Obviously, this year, the assembly was by Zoom. And I'll just mention in passing, analogous to how many participants we have today on this call, the Zoom has really increased our advisor participation. Before Zoom, our advisor participation was fantastic. But although some advisors, live in San Francisco, a lot live, in the peninsula or in the East Bay or in Marin. And so, they had to drive across a bridge or up a peninsula, and it was really a commitment. And now with the Zoom, the participation's up, and we're going to have to decide. Actually, we're going to decide a lot of the things that we used to do in person, we're going to keep doing by Zoom. And just with respect to this year, this is this year's numbers. There's about 80 applications that we received, 27 finalists pitched, and 13 awardee teams were selected by the advisors. And this is a list of the 13 teams. I'm not going to go through these. I'm not going to even highlight any in particular, but it's really a great set of projects. I will point out one thing. Those little colored balls on those colored dots on the far right, those indicate what track the different projects are in. The legend for the tracks is down there at the very, very bottom. The drug projects are red, But you'll notice, I'm noticing myself. So 3 of these projects, 3 of the 13 cross more than one track. And these cross all 5 tracks of drugs, devices, diagnostics, digital, and biotools. So for each of these tracks, I'm not going through these. I'm just going to show you that these are all about the same. All these pipelines. I'm going to focus on the one that I'm the most familiar with, which is new drugs, is that new drug discovery has somewhat of a canonical path from beginning to end, from soup to nuts. And these, and if you Google, if any of you, or maybe some of you can even do this right when you're sitting there. If you Google image drug discovery pipeline, you'll see 100 different versions of this exact same figure, each of which is slightly different from the other, all of which are basically exactly the same. And so this is sort of like the canonical steps of drug discovery, starting with somebody figuring out the mechanistic basis of a disease, thinking, oh, we might be able to intervene if we modulate this hormone, to the far right, where you're doing clinical trials. And as familiar as we all are now with COVID vaccines and COVID drugs, a lot of this is pretty known to many of us now. And a similar pipeline can be drawn for diagnostic projects. And these stages and steps are different. Because just think about the difference. I don't have to tell you the difference between developing some strip that you spit on versus a drug that you swallow. Same thing with medical devices. Same thing with digital health tech solutions. The same thing with platforms and tools. So I said I had another slide about the FDA, and this is the FDA's guidance telling companies, hey, you know what? To facilitate communication with us, we encourage you to put together a target product profile. And you can see what I underlined in red, which actually I grabbed for my first slide. The TPP embodies the notion of beginning with the end in mind. And what I have underlined at the bottom is interesting, and it's the final version of the TPP will be similar to the labeling. And you're thinking labeling. Well, what labeling means is when you go to the pharmacy and you get that little cardboard box and you open it up and there's that super thin paper that's it's like folded like origami. That thin piece of paper is called the package insert. Makes sense. It's the insert in the package. It's also called the product label. Those are synonyms. Package insert, product label are the exact same thing. And all those, you look at that thin piece of paper and you think, oh my goodness, I need a magnifying glass. Or when you watch TV, if you watch TV at night, you'll see those drug ads, and then they'll start reading the fine print with background music to distract you from the fine print. All these, those package inserts all have the exact same format. And this is what they capture. And this is actually the order they're all in. They're always exactly the same. And so I always go to, I think it's either section 11 or section 17, which is sort of like the science underlying the drug. And this is what they look like. This is Humira's, if you can believe it, I'll have to admit, Humira is approved for many, 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 many things. But their package insert's 34 pages long. Okay, this next point I want to make is an important point. What we're focused on is really drug discovery, not drug development. And if you think back to when you were all younger, you'd hear about R&D this, R&D that. Pharmaceutical companies used to call them, they'd have R&D departments, research and development, but they've changed their jargon. They call them now discovery and development. And so discovery usually refers to everything up to clinical trials. And that final clinical candidate, when a pharma company gets there, they're like, oh my goodness, we took it from soup to nuts. We're ready to start clinical trials. That's when the real money starts. That's when you go from spending millions of dollars or single digit, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, or maybe $1 million or $2 million, to when you start spending dozens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars. And so when a company's decided, a big company, like Merck or Glaxo or Bristol Myers Squibb, when they decide to start spending dozens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, they got to make sure that it's going to make sense. And so that's why they put together a target product profile. And that's what's on the right. So they put together a target product profile that is sort of a prophetic or a hope for view of what that thin paper will read. But what we're really focused on, is the left side. We're really coming up with a target candidate profile. And these are the types of fields, I only did it for 2 of the 5. These are the fields that we're gonna be working on this summer. I just thought of something I want to say really quick. So for each project, you're going to have the summer interns, you're going to have the professor, the principal investigator. Hopefully there's going to be people from her lab, either grad students or postdocs involved. There's going to be a catalyst team member, either Nate or myself or Jenny or Rupa, that's also assigned to your project. And so the 4 of us are going to help all of you put together this target product profile because we've done it before. And I'm just pointing out, these are the lists potentially of the fields that are populated for a drug project on the left. And so for a medical device project on the right center. And I just want to point out, because I did this, that the things in bold at the top and the bottom, you'll notice those are sort of in common, right? Those are in common. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you look about what they are. intellectual property, what's the path through the FDA, et cetera, et cetera. And so even though intellectual property is way, way, way different from a drug to a digital health solution, and with a digital health solution, it might be like a copyright, or even you might even keep it as a trade secret. And I'm just pointing out, though, that the general area of market potential, regulatory path, reimbursement, intellectual property is in common, regardless of what type of product it is. The ones in the center that are in non-bold text, those are the ones that are specific for different tracks. The other thing I want to mention is we got a bunch of databases to help you all do this. And so we have about 40 databases, and we'll send you these in the next handful of days. And actually, this is just a screenshot from the Excel. And so there's 40 lines, there's a little description, there's a hyperlink. We also, when I say we, it's not the royal we, it's really the Catalyst program. We actually have access to another really cool database called Global Data. It's a business intelligence database. I think this next slide's on it. And so it focuses on, if you look at the top bullet, on disease markets. It projects, how many people will have this disease in 5 years, 10 years, da, da, da. Look at the third bullet. It has data on over 5,000 drugs, or excuse me, over 85,000 drugs. But to use this database, you might have to go through us. But that's one of the reasons that there's one of us on each of your teams. I'm just throwing out. So I just want to be clear. We got 40 databases that are free. There's one that's somewhat proprietary, but it'll work. And so I'm done right now, and I'm going to hand it over to Ken, unless there's any questions. And I want to thank you all for the fourth time. Go ahead.
Yes, we want to give a quick talk on confidentiality.
Okay, I'll stop sharing right now. Let me just click my little thing on the back. Okay, thank you, Rupa, for mentioning that. Confidentiality is really the other part of the secret sauce for the Catalyst program, because everyone's under confidentiality. And what that means is that everyone can share ideas without the risk of someone running off and starting a company based on the idea. And so the thing about confidentiality that's important is that if you're in like an airport, I'm looking at my clock because I'm thinking about Ken. If you're in like an airport, there's many famous cases of this, where you're in the airport, those lounges you got to pay money to go in, and you're talking to somebody, and the person behind you is listening to what you say. That's actually a public forum, and there's been patents that have been invalidated because of disclosure. And so the thing about confidentiality is you really can't tell anybody. You can't tell your roommate, can't tell your mom, da 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 da. That the stuff you learn from the professors in terms of ideas they have that they might do next, they're sharing those with you, with the knowledge that you're not going to tell your cousin that's a postdoc at Harvard that's in the same field. So anyway, confidentiality is really important. I think that's about all I would say about it. But it's just, anyway, that's good. Any other questions from anybody before I turn it over to Ken?
I don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A, so anyone feel free to either raise your hand or speak up.
Yeah, or you can write me an email. Okay, Ken, I see you in my upper right corner, so thank you very much.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then, okay?
Yes, please.
Great. Well, it's always a privilege to be able to speak to this group, and I did want to underline a couple things that Charles had said. In my current role, I work with a lot of mainly early stage companies, and I will tout the UCSF Catalyst program among your peer institutions across the United States and regionally. I've worked with a number of spin-outs from these companies, from these universities, and I have not encountered anybody as a founder from those places that have really this kind of preparation in terms of their transition and translation from a academic lab into a company. So I think that this is really quite an advantage that UCSF has going for it. Two, I also want to reiterate Charles's and Nate's point about raising questions, and I would really encourage you, and Nate, just please go ahead and interrupt me, because it's a much better discussion rather than a lecture. And three, I think the other thing I want to emphasize that Charles said is that the TPP really is, like that FDA document can be sort of visualized as working backwards. And that's one of the points I'm going to make. So I think that people tend to think of this as a logical path from A to Z, but it's actually, it helps to know W, X, and Y and working backwards to do that. So anyway, I have a couple introductory points, and then we'll go into the outline. There's about 10 slides. We should be able to get through this in the next 20 minutes or so, or 30 minutes. Again, Nate, please interrupt me with the questions from the audience. So,
if you want to put it on presentation mode?
This is helpful for me, because this way everybody, including I, can see the slides that are coming.
Sure.
Is it visible? Is it properly visible, or is there a problem, Rupa?
The fields are a little small, but let's go ahead.
Okay, well, let me do that. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first 2 points I want to make are, so what Charles alluded to, so this is the templates that presumably you're still using, and these are put together. The point is not to read the text, but the point is just to show the documents that some of my colleagues put together a couple of years ago for the Catalyst program. And you may think of them as documents, but they're actually sort of worksheets. And I think that the idea is they serve as outlines for your thought process. And the goal is not necessarily to fill them in to complete it per se, but the goal is to really use them as each one is a mini exercise in thought. And I've seen versions that, some teams have filled out TPPs and they basically cut and pasted sections from their R01s. And that's really not the point of this. The point is really to use it as a space to capture ideas and to really think about, for each of the sections, again, we're not going to go into them, but you can see things like unmet clinical need, et cetera. Really think about what it is, and it's more than just an exercise. It really will help guide and expand your thought process. And to that end, I like to use this slide because I think it, particularly at a place like UCSF, where as a lot of the people who are primary researchers and perhaps not clinicians, ultimately the challenge is how do you take a technology, whether it's a molecule or it's a platform of some sort of sequencing or proteomic array, or whether it's a digital app, and then how do you link that to disease? So the number one question I get as a consultant is Ken, what's the right clinical indication? So that strategic question is probably the biggest and most important question that I get consistently. So it's not as if that people who are already in industry and management positions actually have that solved. Most of them don't. And this is really the key thing. So, the question is, how do you actually do that? Since most technologies can actually be applicable to many different diseases, right? The second part, the B, is that obviously you can envision every disease as a spectrum, and that spectrum can be either early or late, as I've indicated here. It could be mild to severe. It could be treated, untreated versus treated, that sort of thing. But the point is, ideally, at some point, your technology is going to be applicable, probably optimally at some point along this spectrum. And that's part of the TPP exercise, to figure out what exactly you're going to do and what the need is. So for instance, I always like to use the analogy about buying a car. You're not going to buy a Hummer to go to the beach, and you're also not going to drive a convertible to a ski vacation, right? So just because the technology is good doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in every situation. Ideally, you're going to try to find, one or more sweet spots to apply that. And there's a whole variety of things that go into that decision as well. And then part C, in terms of the product focus or the clinical focus, is it really comes down to whether it's a drug, a diagnostic test, or a device. It's really thinking about what is the decision you're going to impact. And we're going to be talking specifically about clinical utility, but ultimately in clinical medicine, things get used that ideally will have clinical utility, meaning that they change the physician decision or it improves patient outcomes. So what you'd like to do is to think that whatever tool you're giving to a clinician, you're going to help them choose either option A or B, and then to improve, one of the, ideal 4 outcomes that I've indicated there. So really, the whole exercise of the TPP is to sort of get you using these sort of 3 sort of, conceptual frameworks to think about how are you going to apply whatever it is you've developed into a specific niched indication that has clinical utility, and then the other terminology we'll talk about is intended use. So in terms of the outline, what I want to talk about is expand a little bit on what Charles talked about in terms of what I mean by company role is what exactly is the role of the TPP for the management team, for the various project teams to work on. The second point I'm going to discuss is the development strategy in terms of how actually the TPP gets executed. And what I mean by process priorities are, how exactly do you actually get that done? What are the considerations? The second is corporate alignment, meaning that it's because of this diversity and the breadth of options you have, it's really thinking about what is the company designed to do? What have you set it up to do? How is it funded? What do the founders want to do? All that can actually influence the TPP as well. The third sub-bullet point, build for need, I cannot emphasize enough. I think that biotech is littered with companies that use the if you build it, they will come philosophy. And in general, they don't come. It's really much better to figure out what the patient, clinical, physician, society, payer needs are as you build your product. And as I already mentioned, the clinical utility is about clinical utility differs from clinical validity, other things. It's really about, what physician decision is changed, and also how does it improve patient outcomes. So the concepts that will be part of this discussion will be the intended use, exactly, in what circumstance the product will be used to guide change clinical behavior, the concept of total available market, which is basically sort of an understanding of the scope, both clinical and financial, about is it worthwhile going into this particular area in terms of the economic impact of your product. And the last thing is just as important as the other two, which is the practice guidelines. As you know, every clinical society has their set of guidelines where they release them every so often, which becomes not only the idealized standard of care, but also it's what payers use to decide what to cover versus what not to cover. So let me stop and take some questions here before we move forward.
Yeah, Ken?
Yep.
A guy named Eric has a question in the chat.
Yep.
And he's asked, well, Eric, why don't you just ask the question out loud because you had to write it.
That'd be helpful, yeah. Or Charles, can you read it?
Yeah, I'm going to read it now. Sorry. At what stage should the project team select the therapeutic indication? He's arguing that therapeutic indication, the choice is very important. When do you choose the therapeutic indication?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I'm actually working on that right now for a company. And the answer is I hate to answer it depends because it sounds like a cop-out, but it's not. It depends on so many things about your preclinical data in terms of understanding the efficacy and also the relative efficacy. One of the concepts that's not on here is the idea of competitive landscape, right? If you think your product works great in, say, breast cancer, and there's like 12 other things, it may be great, but are you really going to go into a very, very crowded field, right? So one way to answer your question is thinking about, what's the competitive advantages of a particular product to help guide that. But that's part of the target product profile exercise as well. Other questions? Nate or Charles, can you?
Yeah, there are no other questions in the chat or Q&A.
Great, okay. So moving forward then, in terms of the point of this discussion will be to, these are the points that I want to make. So learn and incorporate what the market wants beyond what the founders and the chief scientific officer, the chief medical officer and the CEO want. It's really important to understand what the need is and what the various aspects, what we call stakeholders, also think is important. The next point is really about prioritizing, focusing, as Charles was saying, is thinking about, what is the vision, how much money and time do you have to help you define that scope? Sometimes the best product could take 10 years to develop, and maybe you just don't have that time and you don't have $1 billion to develop that product. The third point that I want to make is that the TPP it's a piece of paper. It's also a tool of communication. It's also a goal to complete at a certain time point so that everybody aligns and agrees on what product people are actually developing. The next bullet is about thinking about the intended use. And the intended use, again, is where exactly you're going to place this product and making sure that you understand from all the different team members, which we'll talk about shortly, what their perspectives are beyond the classical, clinical and scientific teams in terms of product development. And finally, the last point that, as I alluded to with regard to the total available market, is thinking about financial metrics in terms of, from a corporate point of view, the idea is to make money at some point, and also thinking about what the guidelines will need in order to incorporate your product into its guidelines. So this slide is really about the roles of the TPP. And so the key point here is that, as I alluded to, classically, when companies are started, there's generally always the R&D team. That's the birth of the company. And then next, there's usually some set of advisors at some university to think about, where should we go in relation to the question that was asked about, how do you prioritize, drug therapies? And so, and this is correct. So I think that most companies do start out this way, but the point I'm trying to make here is what the FDA statement Charles was alluding to is that you really should think about a much more broad approach and sort of working backwards. You have to take into account how difficult is that drug going to be able to manufacture? Is it a biologic, right? And if so, what are the challenges there? How difficult is it going to take to get a device or a drug or a diagnostics reimbursed, right? There's a whole bunch of challenges with regard to that. Regulatory pathway, whether it's FDA or not FDA, requirement. In terms of commercialization, how will you actually market this test? Will people actually buy it? Will the price point be too high for people? Right. And then, I can't emphasize enough bioinformatics is about, everything now is machine learning, AI based, and trying to derive technical things like diagnostic algorithms is particularly, challenging. So really, when you fill out the TPP, ideally you would have, in a company setting, you would have either consultants or full-time people representing all these different stakeholder groups, so that the product in development reflects not just the current but the downstream environment in which the product will be used. And that document, as I've shown here in the sub-bullet too, it's a communication tool, because this is going to evolve over a couple of weeks and a couple of months. So, and then everybody will need to sign off and approve that particular TPP at the corporate level. And that, as I've alluded to in bullet 3, is that sometimes you can't develop the absolute best product because it takes too long, or you don't have the money, or that the board wants you to get something done in 2 years rather than 5 years. So that's really so to me, the TPP is really a dynamic process, and it is a tool and also a goal in of itself. Questions?
Hi, I just wrote my question down in the chat. But my question is, can you share a specific example of a TPP that is currently in clinical trials or preclinical?
Well, I would imagine that almost anything that's at that advanced stage, there is. I can't share anything in particular, but I can tell you that anything that's in a clinical trial setting should have passed internally whatever company's TPP process they had. So, for instance, I'm working with a company right now that's doing a diagnostic product, and they're right now in the midst of evolving the TPP with inputs from the sales and marketing team, and also thinking about the statistical analysis plan for the FDA. So again, I can't give you an example, but every product, I would imagine most products, particularly big companies, will go through the TPP process way before it gets into clinical trials.
If I could Ken, if you just let me add to that. So for a real pharmaceutical company that does it, like Ken said, they put together an ad hoc team. It's very, very proprietary. It's very secretive because that's what their approach that they're going to beat their competitors with. But John, you bring up a good other point, and we'll do this for this summer. We'll find examples. We'll have to get the approval of the guy, the professor whose lab, the person whose lab it's from, but we'll try to get examples of what we think are ideal examples of TPPs from the Catalyst program over the past few years across each of these tracks. So just remind me if I don't initiate that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea, Trust. Sort of like writing your first R01, right? Is that it may be completely different than your project, but it helps understand the general structure and sort of things like that. And but in any case, other questions on this?
Thank you very much. Yep.
Sure. Great question. Okay, so in terms of process priorities, what I mean by that is, again, this issue about thinking early. And again, this is challenging even for many companies that I'm working with now, is about underlying the word early. The earlier you think about something, the more likely you are going to solve it. And this is really where the experience comes in, and having, you know, either experienced management team and or consultants to help you really input early, as soon as you can to that development process. The resources and the timelines thing, again, are critical parts, because, you know, how much time you have. Time, as you will find, is much, much more important than money. You can't increase the time. You can always increase the money. So it really behooves the management team and the project team to think about realistic timelines and deciding, you know, what they can achieve within a certain amount of time. And that relates to the third bullet point, scope and feasibility. The fourth thing in terms of risks, this is something that you know, we're not really taught as academicians. It's really about, I mean, this is critical in terms of how management teams think, and also investors. It is expected that every project has risks, okay? Could be development risks, could be commercial risks, could be reimbursement risks. But the most important thing about there's two verbs, there's identify and there's mitigate. You can identify as many risks as you can, but always when you're presenting to the board and to the management team, to the best you can, find different ways to mitigate those risks, right? And so when people talk about milestones of product development, oftentimes it's really about mitigating the most challenging or eliminating the most difficult risks, okay? So for instance, in drug development, it could be toxicity, right? Every drug has potential toxicity. And so if you can get in, you know, through phase 1 and show that the maximum tolerated dose has minimal adverse effects, well then great, you've just eliminated one of the biggest hurdles in terms of drug development. For diagnostic tests, it's the proof of concept, you know, training study. Can you actually, you know, diagnose the disease you think you can with your algorithm? If you can't, then, you know, obviously you're done. And as I put in bullet 5, management teams have no problems with dealing with risks, with problems, with setbacks, but they need options to help solve those different things. So this is what I mean by process priorities. And within the TPP, again, the collective experience ideally will help identify all these things, and each one of these things becomes a balancing item as you're trying to debate and then finally align on what the target product profile should be. So for instance, let's say a drug, you want it to be 80% efficacious, and then turns out that the cell line data say, you know, or some mouse data say it's only be 60%. Is that going to be acceptable or not, right? Or if we say, yeah, we can get this done in 2.5 years, but we only have 2 years, you know, are you going to cut corners, and will you tolerate those risks? So everything comes into play in terms of the TPP, in terms of the trade-offs of your technology, your strategy, your product development, and the other other goals like financial and resources. The next section that we've alluded to already is corporate alignment. And this is also really key because, you know, just like in the academic setting, one of the things you have to do is you have to manage up, and you also have to manage out, meaning expectations, right? So the goal is that particular place at UC, right? You've got a lot of, you know, scientific expertise. How are you going to make that into an efficacious clinical product, meaning one that's actually going to change the way things are done right now? right? To the question about a drug indication, you want to make something that's going to be ideally better than the current offerings, although non-inferiority is certainly also an option, right? But I think that so when I start working with the company, the second bullet point is the first question that I ask during the interview process with the CEO or the board. I say, look, what is your vision as a CEO? What is the founder vision? What does the board of directors want? Because ultimately, once I know that, I can sort of figure out, I can basically make a diagnosis and figure out what the challenge is. And then similarly with the existing management team, the CEO, the CFO, the chief medical officer, CSO. And a lot of times, the reason I put that on here so high is because a lot of times they don't know. There is no clear vision. There are too many options for them to go on. I have one company that exemplifies this perfectly. They actually have an embarrassment of choices. And ultimately, though there is sort of a general vision, in which direction to go and to place the heavy bet on is actually not clear. The next concept about metrics we've talked about again is the metrics are, how good does a product have to be? How soon can you get it done? How much money will you need to get this done? How big will the studies have to be, right? And then the related second subsidiary bullet point, the financial return on investment is really a critical thing. And this is probably one of the most foreign things in an academic environment, okay? We're not taught to think about the financial benefit of something. We're taught as academicians to ignore costs in our decision-making process. We do what's best for the patient first and worry about, charges and costs later on. In the business setting, largely because you have to survive, but in addition, a business should be, should generate profits for the investors. You have to think about the financial ROI at every level, whether it's hiring somebody, designing a pilot study, designing your phase 1, 2, or 3 studies, or defining your device or diagnostic studies. Each thing you do should ideally have some sort of ROI assigned to it. And that relates, to the final bullet point. It's about, how much resources and times, and the top resource on this list is actually talent. Do you have the right bioinformatics team? Do you have the right drug development team? Do you have the right, synthetic chemists to sort of divide your product? And that's actually, in today's market, as you'll see, particularly here in the Bay Area, one of the hardest things to do is actually, getting that talent. So this is something that is a little bit less pertinent to your current exercise, but I think that as you get more familiar and or start working with companies, you'll begin to see that every company, and this is sort of part of the corporate culture, is understanding what it is they want to do versus what they can do given the resource limitations. Questions? Okay.
I still see no questions in the chat.
Great. Okay. So the next topic I want to talk about, I've alluded to again, is what I call bill for need. And so this is again, related to that corporate strategy I was talking about earlier. In basically, what I would encourage all of you to do is to the best you can understand what the market wants. And oftentimes, as academics, our first instinct is to go to the literature, but all the literature is biased because it's what people publish, right? And practitioners in the real world, they don't publish, right? Academicians publish. And so there's automatically going to be a skew in what is perceived as the need. Clinical trials are biased because of the patients that they enroll in terms of healthy or educated or whatnot. So there's great examples where, phase 3 trials are not representative of real world populations. And also what different, there's the term I've used here is stakeholders, the industry term for different groups who have different perspectives on what value that clinical product should be. So who are the major stakeholders? The major stakeholders are the users, meaning patients and physicians. Even between patients and physicians, there's actually different perspectives of what the stakeholder priority should be. For patients, it could be toxicity, it could be dosing. For physicians, about efficacy versus balancing toxicity. There's a difference between what academicians want, and there's a difference between what community practitioners want in terms of their perspectives on the need. Clinical societies like the American Heart Association or the American Lung Association, they have more macroscopic perspective on what's needed. And also this pertains to what's called the level of evidence, or the quality of the data and the number and types of publications, right? All that's another sort of deliverable in terms of what the market wants. The other key stakeholders are the regulators like the FDA or CMS. You have payers, private insurers, and also CMS under payers. Then you also have the health economic perspective in terms of, does this actually, add value in terms of, quality adjusted life years? Is it worth it for the society to pay $100,000 or $1 million for a course of a therapy for a particular, drug? And so I've envisioned here sort of a triangular relationship, because I think in general it can be sort of distilled this way. So I've clumped the more clinical entities into one at the top of the triangle: patient, physician, and clinical societies. And then regulatory and payer are different because they actually have different perspectives. And one thing that FDA and CMS have actually done is recently they've actually tried to simplify that. So some of these, there's a new breakthrough designation that says that if you get breakthrough designation from the FDA, that CMS will automatically cover it. We'll see what happens. That's still being worked on. But traditionally for drugs, a regulatory approval meant that the drug would get paid for. That does not hold for diagnostics or for devices per se. So you still have to go through a reimbursement exercise to get some of those things paid for. And again, as the dotted arrow below in terms of health economics, just because something is approved doesn't mean it's going to be used. And also just because something's approved doesn't mean it's going to be paid for. And even if it is paid for, it doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a lot of criticism that it may or may not add sufficient value by whatever quantitative metric in terms of the impact on clinical outcomes or on the practice of that particular sub area. So this is again something that's hard to do in your current environment in terms of exercise. But when you are thinking about your product development, think about what all these people will want. Particularly I would say the clinical societies is something that you can look at because those guidelines are published for the things that are published. And as the clinicians in the room know, much of medicine is practiced without guidelines. It's based on tradition. But for things for which there are guidelines, changing those guidelines will depend on the levels of evidence. Questions? Okay. So in the last couple of slides, I want to talk about the clinical utility and then moving to the key concepts. So clinical utility, as I alluded to, is really about will it improve patient outcomes, and will it change my or anybody else's decision as a clinician on what to do, whether it's therapeutics, whether it's surgical, whether it's another diagnostic test, whether it's discharging from the hospital, whether it's admitting to the hospital through the ED, whatever that is. The ideal product should have clinical utility in terms with data to support that it shows that it improves survival, that it decreases toxicity, that it decreases other morbidity or whatnot. And these are particularly challenging because obviously drugs have always had this particular metric, but for things like devices and diagnostic tools, really in the last 10 years, there's been this push to demonstrate clinical utility. And again, for the clinicians in the room, a lot of what we do does not have demonstrable clinical utility. We do things because that's what we're taught, and that's the best data that we have right now. But this is a big challenge for many small companies because doing these clinical utility studies is difficult. A, because they may not have been done before, and B, deciding what is a reasonable metric to shoot for can actually be quite challenging as well. The other aspect of clinical utility is in terms of the relative performance is what I mentioned earlier in terms of competitive landscape is it sufficiently better than what currently exists for it to be used in practice? The next sub bullet point is what problems might the product create? The challenge with some things is, okay, a new drug could cause new toxicities, and it could have a different risk-benefit ratio in terms of that particular treatment. A new diagnostic test could actually introduce confusion into an established evaluation, even though it may not be great. And then finally, the last thing in terms of efficacy is the incremental benefit of that product, is it worth it for the price that's being charged by the company? And again, this is probably more an advanced topic, but again, these are really critical things when you think about how good that product is. So as a derivative of that, there's a very important use, concept called intended use. So an intended use is really about, it's not a clinical indication. That's different. A clinical, for instance, for one clinical indication, let's say lung cancer, there could be a variety of different intended uses for even the same device or tool, right? And so I have two examples I've drafted. So the top sentence is, the intended use of the excess is to provide clinicians with a tool for cancer screening, okay? Well, that's fine, but it's really pretty broad. And the point of the second example is, as you learn to craft intended uses, from a regulatory perspective and for marketing perspective and for the clinical adoption, you ideally want to be sufficiently focused, but also broad enough to make sure that you balance the market size and the efficacy of your product. So what I wrote in the bottom one is assessment identification of, as an example, of people with lung nodules that are likely to not be cancer, right? So it basically a rule out test, which is something that I've done a couple of times. So you can just see the example between the top and the bottom sentences in terms of the specificity and the clarity of what that product is supposed to do. And again, this is part of that whole strategic question about clinical indication selection and also the intended use. With that, the other consideration for intended use in clinical utility development is what we call the total available market, a very straightforward but critical metric that everybody talks about. And it's a very simple calculation, which is basically, if I develop this product, how many patients might actually use it, and how will the company generate revenue for this product? So the basic math is, okay, how many patients are eligible for the test? What is my list price or my discounted price, however you calculate it. And then the last one is really important, which is how many times can I use this test in terms of the coverage, right? So the straightforward calculation, so a TAM of, for 100,000 patients at $1,000, for the device or drug, and use it twice a year, your TAM is $200 million. Okay, so you can see that that figure is easily adjustable by, you can either raise the price or you can raise the frequency. Oftentimes it's actually harder to raise the patients, but this is what drug companies do, right? They keep trying to expand the use population to increase that first parameter while charging a high price point, right? And so the bottom figure is really graphical. It just represents is that you can charge a high price for something that has high clinical utility here on the y-axis when there's few other options. However, even something with high clinical or moderate clinical utility, the more options there are available that are similar to it, the lower, just from the competitive aspect of the market, you're gonna be able to charge for that test, right? So this is the sweet spot when you're developing your product, to develop something that's groundbreaking, that's new, that's novel, that answers a question that hasn't been cracked yet, like Alzheimer's, right? Where there's few other options, and that's where they justify. So orphan indications satisfy this particular thing. So this is important. And so I'm working with a company right now where they're going after some very critically important questions, but in tiny markets. And what they don't understand, that having a market of 5,000 patients, it may work, but it's never going to be a viable product for the company in terms of generating revenue. And the last thing is really about practice guidelines. I cannot tell you how important this is, because what society guidelines care about is clinical efficacy and clinical safety, right? They don't care about price, right? They don't care about all these other things. They want to make sure that it works for patients. And again, even though a lot of things we do in medicine are not, don't have a lot of evidence, obviously the priority is to require high levels of evidence from the best studies you can do, prospective, ideally randomized, multi-center studies, which are difficult to do, outside of drug studies. And because what each society does is they issue practice guidelines, which largely should not only guide what clinicians do and mandate that standard of care, but payers, insurance companies will decide what to pay for and what not to pay for based on what are in guidelines. So if you have a great product in one paper, if it doesn't meet one or more payers' requirements, if it's listed as, if it's characterized as experimental or investigational, it's not likely going to be covered. And so you can offer the test and charge whatever you want. And even if people buy it, it may not get reimbursed. So again, really thinking early on and working with expert clinicians on those panels, working with reimbursement experts, it's really important to think about, not just the product itself, but how will you develop what will be the studies you will need to develop the evidence dossier to get this accepted in the future by a society guidelines committee. So we've talked a lot we've talked about a lot of things in a very short period of time, and I just want to reiterate sort of the key take-homes. So really understanding what the market wants beyond how sexy the technology or how good it works or that Science or Nature paper. It's really thinking about what's the clinical question, what problem are you trying to solve? The second thing is again, trying to align the internal corporate vision with the resources and timelines that that particular company has to begin to help shape your TPP and your product scope, right? And again, the third bullet point, the TPP is not just the worksheet itself. It's really about, even among your summertime team, is how will you compromise, how will you gather all the different considerations, and then how you compromise based on the various limiting parameters you have to optimize that TPP for this particular project. And then part of that is bullet point 4 is thinking about whoever's representing the payer or the commercial team or the clinical team, how will you balance all the different perspectives? And finally, again, and this is critical, this is something we talk about at the Catalyst meetings, is thinking about, how will this product be considered in the eventual competitive clinical situation, whether it's lung cancer or heart failure or in some infectious disease, is will it be, is there a clear path to developing evidence to get this into society guidelines, and thinking about, what would it take to cost to develop the product, and how would that influence the final cost and charge for that particular product. So with that, I'll stop, but I really appreciate the questions and the opportunity to share at least my perspectives on a target product profile.
Great. Hey, Ken, there is a question from Salvador Alvarado. Would you like to just ask it yourself, Salvador?
Sure, yeah. I had a question about orphan drugs and how they're relating to the thinking about the market and all of that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to think about that. So one of which is, from a science perspective, obviously, it's likely going to be, very, very specifically pathway based. And so the one way to answer your question is there's actually some venture capital groups, Salvador, that actually focus just here on this part of the curve, right? So they will only invest in companies that have, one of the requirements will be that there are no other options for that particular, collagen storage disease or something like that, right? So their expectation is that this is going to be high risk, but potentially high reward. Okay, so that's that's the general characterization, because orphan drugs, by definition, the indication has to have fewer than 20,000 patients, right? And then obviously, it's not only hard to develop them, methodologically, but also clinically to do studies in them, right? So there's a whole variety of things you have to think about in terms of the science, the relative efficacy bar you need to achieve, what difference do you have to make for that particular indication? And then also thinking about how you do the study, what the FDA or any other regulatory agency would require to do that. But certainly from the business perspective, it's largely driven by low competition, great clinical utility, and potential high price point. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Ken, that was really a great talk. I thought, yeah, you went into a lot of detail and specifics and nuance, so I really appreciate that.
Great.
So if there are no more questions right now, I'm going to turn it over to Nate, who I think has been feverishly creating breakout rooms and assigning us to them. So are you good, Nate?
Yes, we're good. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms now. There are a few people who I couldn't match. So once everybody goes to the breakout room, I'll double check with you and see which room you'd like to go to.
Yeah, if I can just say, let me just say something. So I looked through the attendees, and not very many of the PIs are on the call, which is fine. It was sort of an optional thing for them because they've done it. But here's the thing. it may well be that in your little room, it's the other interns that have been assigned to this project. And so that'll just be fantastic for you to talk amongst yourselves. And if there is someone here from the university, from the project, it'll be great to talk to them too. I just wanted to mention that.
And also the project staff, we can jump into the different breakout rooms for our teams.
Sure. Okay, Nate.
Great.